One of the many sort of jokes about economics and economists goes something like this, that if you see an economist on the street and ask, hi, how's your wife or how's your husband, the response is relative to what? And I think nowhere does that apply more than the topic of this panel, trade. Is how's trade doing? Well, relative to what? More trade, less trade, no trade, different trade. And as motivation for the four presentations and the two responses that we will hear this morning, I guess I'd make 3 points by way of introduction. The first is what Rob Johnson calls misspecified economics. We teach introductory trade and persist with that for a good long time, a certain way, and in it, there's several exceptions and add-ons that are taught in that fashion, when in fact what experience tells us is that the exceptions and add-ons may be more central to understanding trade than simply at the end of the session, so to speak. The second thought sparked by this panel is that we might have missed the politics and civics of trade, specifically any economic interaction, but especially trade, has distributional consequences, and these have civic and political implications. Trade is not something that is done simply by markets and market participants. It is often done strategically. I come from Canada, the home of Bombardier. We've just been through a week of very strategic behavior between the Europeans, the Americans, and the Canadians around Boeing, Airbus, and Bombardier when it comes to the manufacture of aircraft. So understanding the politics of trade is at least as important as getting trade technically right. And the third and final point I'd make is that just as a generation ago, we made the transition from trade in goods to understanding trade in services, and that involved changing some of the analytics, changing some of the empirics, and therefore changing some of the policy prescriptions. We might now be going through a similar phase as trade in ideas and trade in IP comes to dominate and comes to be at least as central as goods and services might be. And it has its own characteristics. We haven't fully understood them all, but we know enough about this to think that there might be something that then affects the way we see trade. And the four panelists and two discussants we have been dealing with one or more of these issues head on for some time. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brad. Brad, welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Given that this is Edinburgh, is how I think you pronounce it, I wanted to start with Davy Hume, but I don't think I have time. So let me start with David Ricardo. At his inmost core, David Ricardo truly believes in the labor theory of value. He believes in labor theory value prices because he sees capital flowing to put people to work wherever those things can be made with the fewest workers. And this poses a grave problem for Ricardo. The labor theory of value tells him that production, capitalist production at least, should take place according to absolute advantage. And what about those living in countries with no absolute advantage? By the labor theory of value logic, they should be left outside the market economy, restricted to subsistence agriculture, unable to provide enough to sell and survive in the market, given that the labor theory of value rules. Ricardo's problem is that this inmost belief of his, this inmost core belief of his, has to jostle with an empirical reality in which even low productivity countries are able to specialize and export something, and with his belief in Davy Hume's price, specie flow, quantity theory of money, price level mechanism in Hume's essay On the Balance of Trade. Thus, the doctrine of comparative advantage becomes Ricardo's way out. For him, the labor theory of value holds within countries, and as far as between countries is concerned, countries' overall price levels relative to each other rise and fall as a result of specie flows until trade balances. And what is left is international commodity price differentials that follow comparative advantage, that offer profit opportunities to merchants engaged in international trade. and these merchants' demand then induces specialization. Thus, Ricardo reconciles his belief in the labor theory of value with his belief in Hume's on the balance of trade, and with the fact that capitalist production is not confined to those industry places with absolute advantage. His doctrine reconciles his conflicting theoretical commitments with the reality he sees as best he can, and manages to hold principles of political economy and taxation together as an intellectual endeavor, given the conflicts between the different core theoretical commitments he has. That's Ricardo. Now, by now, note, we are very far away from the idea that comparative advantage is and justifies the claim that free trade is the best in the best of all possible worlds. Indeed, there are a lot of holes in the argument that free trade is the best of all possible worlds. There is the optimal tariff argument. Shift the terms of trade in your favor by being clever. There is the large empirical fact of and underemployment. There are externalities as sources of economic growth. In any of the extent of the market, economies of scale, Dixit-Stiglitz variety, learning by doing, communities of engineering practice, focus of inventive activity, or any of its other many flavors. And fourth, there's internal maldistribution, which means that the greatest profit is at best orthogonal to the, quote, greatest good of the greatest number, the utilitarian greatest good of the greatest number, which is what policy should seek. And given these argumentative holes, the true arguments for free trade have always been a level or two deeper than comparative advantage. The argument has been that optimal tariff equilibria exist, but that they are unstable and fragile in a game theory sense and lead to a downward spiral. There's the argument that and underemployment exist, but that other policy tools than trade restrictions resolve unemployment in ways that are not beggar thy neighbor. There is the argument that countries, except for the very lucky, lack the administrative competence to successfully execute manufacturing export-based industrial policies, and so you should try not to make the bureaucracy aware of the theoretical case for such things. There is the argument that trade restrictions are uniquely vulnerable to rent seeking by the rich. And so of all tools the government might use, this is one to be especially avoided. The only argumentative hole for which nothing can be done is the internal maldistribution hole. But in the age of laissez-faire, people tried to close even that. There is the late 19th century social Darwinist move. Redefine the social welfare function as not the greatest good, but the greatest number in the utilitarian sense, but as the evolutionary dominance and advance of the, quote, fittest, unquote, that is, the richest humans. Do that, and gross inequality becomes not a utilitarian vice, but a social Darwinist and evolutionary virtue. Hence, comparative advantage takes the form then of an exoteric teaching, an ironclad mathematical demonstration that provides a reason for believing political economic doctrines supporting free trade that are in fact truly justified by more complicated and sophisticated arguments. And I must say these more complicated and sophisticated arguments are not just more complicated, but also more debatable and dubious than as an ironclad mathematical demonstration that via free trade, Portugal can sell the labor of 80 of its men for products that it would require 90 of its men to make, while England can sell the labor of 100 of its men and get in return products it would take 110 of its men to make. And you can think various things about these attempts to close the holes in the argument and establish the, quote, esoteric, unquote, arguments for free trade. But even if you buy all the esoteric arguments, there is still the question of the global wealth distribution. Stipulate that the Arrow-Debreu-McKenzie machine generates a Pareto optimal result. Stipulate that every Pareto optimal allocation maximizes some social welfare function as it does. The question arises, what social welfare function does the Arrow-Debreu-McKenzie machine maximize? And the Arrow-Debreu-McKenzie machine, it maximizes the social welfare with Negishi weights. If you could call the market up to the stage and ask you, say, hey, Ms. Market, what is the social welfare function that you are actually maximizing through your role as a social calculation and allocation mechanism? The market would say, well, I'm maximizing a weighted sum of individual utilities, and I'm weighting each individual's utility in that maximization by the inverse of their marginal utility of wealth. If the typical utility function has to have a curvature, the decreasing marginal utility of wealth, corresponding to a relative risk aversion parameter of 1, then my Negishi weights are proportional to each individual's lifetime wealth. If the typical coefficient of relative risk aversion implies a curvature, a declining marginal utility of wealth that produces a coefficient of relative risk aversion of 3, then my Negishi weights are proportional to the cube of each individual's wealth. And in that case, we cannot escape the conclusion that comparative advantage is the ideology of a market system that works for the interest of the wealthy. For comparative advantage is the market economy on the international scale. And the market economy is, via the Negishi weights that it assigns to the social welfare function it actually maximizes, is a collective human device for satisfying the wants of the well-off. And the well-off are those who control scarce resources which are useful for producing things for which the rich of the world have a serious Jones. And I did have time for Davy Hume after all, but it would break up the flow for me to go back. So let me say thank you, and let me give 3 minutes and 30 seconds to the Commons.
How nice. Thank you. Brett, you've set up the broad issue really well for the rest of us, and thank you for the generous donation as well. Nadia.
Thank you. Thank you, Brett, for giving more time for the comments. I will try to do the same, so trying to stick to 10 minutes instead of 12. So, well, first I want to apologize to my discussants because my paper was really a very, very, very provisional draft, so preliminary draft. So I'll try to convey some more details about the basic idea with this presentation. Well, I think it's quite clear that international trade dramatically increased in the latest decades, and this is especially true for trade in intermediates rather than trade in final goods. And it is exactly the issue of trade in intermediates which shapes international division of labor. So, especially European capitalism underwent through a huge transformation in the latest decades. So we could see an increasing concentration of property, especially in core countries such as Germany, and also this was coupled with an increasing decentralization of production. So many different stages of production of final goods were decentralized to different countries than the one who finally assembled the final good. So I will just focus on German automotive sector, that is to say cars finally assembled in Germany and all the parts and components which are part of this final commodity are actually produced in many different countries, especially within European Union. So I cannot even see the slide, so I think it's better than there. This graph shows the relative importance of these different industrial sectors in triggering intermediate trade in the European Union. We can see that the 4 industrial sectors which were more relevant in this respect were basic and fabricated metals, chemical products, transport equipment, and electrical and optical equipment. So we have 2, let's say, traditional sectors, basic and fabricated metal and chemical products, and 2 so-called high-tech sectors, so transport equipment and electrical and optical equipment. In Europe, in the EU, the automotive sector, so transport equipment, is one of the most relevant sectors, actually, especially in terms of international division of labor. And, of course, the lion's share in cars production in Europe is Germany's. So, both for final production, that is to say the pink line, and for intermediate production, the blue line, Germany played a very relevant role. But if we look at geographical composition of the production chain of German cars, it is to say where intermediate parts and components come from, we can see that German, let's call it autonomous components, so parts and components which are actually produced in Germany, the percentage of German autonomous components declines through time, and we can see that there are some countries whose importance as a provider of parts and components increased in time period considered. And the 3 countries which increased their participation to this production chain the most were actually Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. We can see here that, and also Slovakia to a lesser extent. So we can see from this graph that these are average nominal wages in different European countries. Of course, the 3 countries I mentioned and Slovakia are those with the lowest nominal wages in the European Union. So I think that actually, I think it's quite clear that actually it's not market forces or free competition what shapes the structure of international division of labor, but rather it's those who are at the head of production chains who make strategic decisions about what is more convenient in terms of profitability. So I think it's not comparative advantages in terms of productivity, what determines the structure, geographical structure of international division of labor, but rather absolute advantages in terms of profitability. So the elites, or let's say capitalists located in core countries, just take advantage of wage, labor conditions, social conditions, differentials, moving those stages of production which are especially labor intensive to those countries where wages are lower and so on. So yeah, I think that comparative advantage theory is the theory of comparatively advantaged. It is so twice. First, because core countries are advantaged compared to peripheral countries, and third, because of course profit earners are advantaged compared to wage earners. So the usual comparative advantage story would be that market forces and free competition shapes the international division of labor in such a way that comparatively advantaged countries just specialize in those stages of production in which they have an advantage in terms of productivity, comparative advantage in terms of productivity, and this leads to gains for all countries involved in production. Actually, what we see is that countries which are gaining more relevance in this international division of labor are not experiencing any advantage from international trade, because wages are getting lower, labor conditions are getting worse, with the argument that we need to be more internationally competitive, and so we have to make our labor markets more flexible. So I don't think that countries which are growing and are specializing in certain stages of production are experiencing gains from this situation. And I also think that we have been mentioning the issue of new technologies several times yesterday, and what is called like Industry 4.0, so this new wave of this fourth industrial revolution, which is normally presented as something which has to do with automation, and so loss of jobs because of automation, while I think it's very much more about connectivity and Internet of Things, big data, which allows to push international division of labor further because it reduces costs connected to logistics, transport costs, and whatever. So, and it makes lean production or just-in-time production much easier. So this phenomenon is going to push further this international division of labor, and what happens is that workers from different countries are put in harsh competition among each other. So this is something which shapes public opinion and political debate towards making wages lower and towards implementing labor markets reforms and so on, which we could see, for example, in Italy with the argument of making international competitiveness, boosting international competitiveness. So just to conclude, and I will also give some more minutes for comments, I think that the answer to the question asked by this session, whether comparative advantage theory is the theory of comparative advantages? Yes. And of course, from my point of view, those who are comparatively disadvantaged are most of all workers in all countries involved in this phenomenon of international division of labor. Thank you.
Nadia, thank you. You've sort of put on the table two issues which I suspect we'll come back to at the end. One, sort of institutions matter, and second, race to the bottom. And how do we change that dynamic, at least in this context. The next presentation, I believe, is by video, and it's Kaveh Majlesi from Harvard, who could not join us in person.
Right. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be able to talk about this paper. I apologize that I wasn't able to travel, but I guess thanks to technology and globalization, I can actually present the paper. So this paper is joined with David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hansen, and we think about the electoral consequences of rising trade exposure in the context of the United States. Well, as probably many of you know, we have seen this rising political polarization in many dimensions of US politics, other advanced economies. But so if you look at this graph, so here you see kind of a polarization in the Congress, in the US Congress, right? So if you look at the nominated score of the Republicans versus Democrats, nominated score being the a number between -1 and 1, think of -1 being the most liberal and 1 being the most conservative based on the votes that you actually cast. Republicans have moved dramatically to the right in the past couple of decades, while Democrats have mildly shifted to the left. So this is a phenomenon that many people have thought about. What was the reason behind it? And we want to kind of contribute to that, I guess. So one more, so we also know about the rise of China, right? As a source of manufacturing in the world. So this graph shows the share of world manufacturing exports by China, the red line. And it's kind of amazing what has happened in the past 20 years, that by like 2015, I believe it reached to 17 or 18% of the world manufacturing exports. And the question that we want to answer, or we thought in the beginning, was like whether these two are related in a way, right? And this has been a long project, almost 3 to 4 years we have been working on it, and I'm happy to share some of the results with you. So the question is, did China trade shock to US manufacturing contribute to the widening ideological divide in the Congress? We all know about the economic, at least the negative economic impacts of sharp rise in Chinese import competition. I mean, many people have worked on this. We know that closure of manufacturing plants, lower employment, lower lifetime incomes, rising social maladies are all among the kind of the effects of China import competition in the areas that were hit hard, right? In this work, we wanna ask whether trade shocks make ideological divisions more extreme, and whether these shocks actually altered the ideological composition of US elected representatives. Now, this could happen via different channels, and I try to talk about some of those that we kind of think about in the paper, but not all of them. We think about the raising competitiveness of the elections. We think whether this is just an anti-incumbency kind of phenomena. Is it the case that like a negative shock happens and we see a cross-party turnover in this period of time? Is it about generating within party turnover so that like more extreme candidates rise to the top of the ticket? And does it kind of shift the ideological affiliation of those elected? Before going to results, let me very briefly talk about how we do this. I know that we don't have enough time in this presentation for this kind of talk, but we basically match local labor markets where we can measure China shock to congressional districts, and it is actually very challenging because congressional districts can have very extreme shapes, mostly because of gerrymandering that doesn't correspond to any definition of local labor markets geographically. Now, so this dark green you see here is the 12 districts in North Carolina. And once one of the members of the North Carolina House of Representatives said that if you drove down the interstate with both car doors open, you would kill most of the people in the district. So he was pointing out this thing that, well, this whole redrawing the border has gone too far. And I certainly think that's true. But the problem here is that, well, these kind of districts belong to more than one local labor markets. And it's not obvious a shock to a labor market, how does it translate to the political outcomes in the districts? So what we do, we look at voting outcomes at the intersection of a county, which is part of a labor market, and the congressional district, so that we can transmit the shock to the congressional outcomes. I'll be happy to talk about it afterwards, but let me show you some results. I think that's best for this presentation. So this is kind of the geography of trade exposure in the United States. The darker it gets, it means that it was hit more negatively, basically, by China shock. Now, let me go through some of these channels that I mentioned briefly before. So is it the case that China shock increased competitiveness? And the answer is yes. So what we find is that in the congressional districts that were hit more negatively, the probability of both parties competing goes up, the number of votes cast goes up, and the number of registered voters goes up, and we observe more individual donations in those races. So we are facing like a more heated up races, which could lead to taking more extreme stance that could roll over to the Congress itself and increase the polarization. We also think about whether this causes cross-party turnover. Is it the case that the only phenomena that we observe is like this anti-incumbency? Democrats are in the House, negative shocks happen, Republicans are elected, or vice versa? And the answer is no. We do not actually observe that. What we do observe is that in the initially democratic districts, some of the people kind of lose their seats to the conservatives, and in initially Republican districts, we certainly the probability of actually become a Democrat, choosing a Democrat, actually goes down. What we observe is that they choose a different representative. And as we see further down the presentation, they choose actually a more conservative one. So we are facing a within-party turnover in the case of the Republican. Cross-party turnover is only evident in the case of the Democrats. And then we move to the main part of the paper, which is about changing ideological affiliation of those elected. So what we do is that we define moderates, right? And we ask, is it the case that trade exposure hurts moderates? And the answer is definitely yes. Regardless of whether they are Democrats or Republicans, trade exposure makes the election of moderates less likely. So who is gaining then? So is it the liberal Democrats? Is it or the conservative Republicans? And on average, it's certainly the case that conservative Republicans are winning here. We also look at, because the period of our study goes from 2002 to 2010, we also look at the election of kind of congressmen and congresswomen who became the part of the Tea Party in the Congress. And we find that congressional districts that were hit more negatively were more likely to elect such a candidate. But then what is the what's the actual mechanism behind this? This is, of course, very difficult to pin down. However, and we have worked very hard on this. What we have found consistent with theories out there is more of like an in-group, out-group rising tensions. When we divide our counties to those with more than half of the voting age population being non-Hispanic white, we see that the only gain is to conservative Republicans, right? So moderate Democrats and Republicans lose and conservative Republicans gain. On the other hand, if you look at non-Hispanic whites, we see the other way around. It's actually the liberal Democrats who are winning and the moderate Democrats who are losing, right? So it seems like along some social lines, some racial backgrounds, we observe some action here. So we take it further and we look at some surveys, right? So is it the case that the beliefs of the electorate shifted, or it's just something on the side of the elected officials? We divide our sample into non-Hispanics, whites, and others, and we observe clearly that the beliefs of those people, belief of the non-Hispanics white, as a result of the trade shock, moved to the right. Okay? So it's not just some sort of like elected officials choosing to be that way. It also reflects the preferences of the electorate along some racial societal background. Now, to kind of corroborate these results, we divide our shock into a male versus female component, right? And we find that it's only the trade shocks to industries that more intensively employed white males that are kind of driving our results. These are the shocks that kind of hurt the moderates and help conservative Republicans. Right? It kind of coincides with a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, let's say. We also run like a counterfactual vote change for alternative trade shocks on the presidential election. So we take the year 2000 as the base, 2016 as the last year, and what we run counterfactuals, and what we find is that if the trade shock with China was 50% smaller than what actually happened, we would have seen a different electoral votes for Democrats versus Republicans. Of course, it's a very simplistic analysis, because if it were the case, this 50% thing, then we wouldn't have the candidates that we have. Let me conclude by saying that it seems like trade shocks actually did affect the ideological composition of the Congress, and maybe the presidential election is not as anomalous in retrospect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. So Kaveh's presentation has put a point to the one of the drivers of this panel, which is that politics matters, and at least in the work he and his colleagues have done in the US context, there's an interplay between sort of politics, ideology, race, and gender as well. And the question of whether the ins and outs live in the same country or in different countries, which is the essence of the trade dilemma. We'll finish our sort of 4 presentations with Arjun and his paper.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be the 4th contestant in today's Let's Try to Summarize a 90-page paper in 12 minutes experience. All right, we'll see how it goes. I am going to be speaking about something which is slightly different to the other topics that we've broached here today, and which is really the issue of intellectual property in trade policy. In my view, that has been perhaps the single most consequential difference in trade and trade policy over the last 30 years. And of course, it was formalized and legitimized most effectively in 1995 with the TRIPS agreement. What I'm going to be speaking about today is really the issue of access to medicines. And right from the outset, this was a big concern in trade policy. From the Doha round, we had a big sort of concession that we ought to have flexibilities in trade in the TRIPS agreement to allow developing countries in particular to utilize mechanisms in which they can actually protect their public health. And what I'm going to be doing in the next 11 minutes that I have is simply to focus on the question of how this is played out in India, which has been called by the WHO as the pharmacy of the developing world. And I really believe that's ground zero for access to medicines issues going forward. Now, very interestingly, this issue of flexibilities, when it was first put up, it was not clear how we would actually bring about and use these flexibilities. But it seems clear that through state practice in many countries, specifically in countries like Thailand, India, Brazil, and other places, there have been many different ways in which TRIPS flexibilities have been used. To me, the two most powerful ones have been the use of compulsory licenses, where developing countries say, we will not respect a patent, we will import generics because we have a public health emergency. Or having national patent law allow for things like pre-grant patent oppositions, which will allow countries to say, okay, this will not pass our patent screening, and so an opposition can be done even before the patent is granted. And so, in the first 10 years after the accession to TRIPS, perhaps the first sort of real pushback from developing countries was in Thailand, with the Thai compulsory licenses between 2006 and 2008. Much to the chagrin of multinational pharma, the Thai government decided to actually issue compulsory licenses across a whole range of drugs to do with heart disease, HIV, and specifically cancer. And this was really the first pushback. But perhaps the more intensive pushback happened, as I said, in ground zero, which is India, where a national patent law, which was sort of passed in 2005, allowed for many more flexibilities and allowed, within the confines of the TRIPS agreement, for India to push back and to actually push back against patents. It's very important because India also has a big generics industry. And starting around 2008, when things went up for litigation, there were a series of spectacular victories won by generic pharma and by civil society organizations. So, for example, in 2011, an AIDS drug by Abbott and BMS was rejected by the Indian patent courts. A very famous case in 2013, Novartis's drug Gleevec, again, the patent was rejected. India said no to HIV drug patents in 2008, another case. AstraZeneca, another important battle, which again went in favor of generics. And then finally, two more, Abbott's Kaletra and Roche's Herceptin, which is a breast cancer drug, again went through litigation and was rejected for patent approval. So one might imagine, look, everything is fine. TRIPS flexibilities allow countries to protect themselves when there is a public health emergency. And this is going to continue, and as long as countries are brave enough to actually to face this, things are going to be okay. Well, not so fast. I apologize. I know this meme is a little old, but I think it's really perfect because I've always imagined Sauron's eye to be the US trade representative, looking all over for intellectual property violations. But, and of course, Sean Bean is always right, always pessimistic, and always dies early, which seems to be the sort of theme going further. Here are the problems. India is now facing the industry in which the US really has a comparative advantage, which is lobbying and litigation, right? There's been very serious attacks on the Indian patent law by Bayer specifically, which tried very hard to assume patent linkage, something which they actually don't even have in the European law. And a bigger one, which is Novartis, is trying to attack maybe the most significant part of Indian law, which is called Section 3D, and thus far unsuccessfully, but really trying to overturn patent law in and of itself. And while litigation is probably the most obvious and sort of visible manifestation of the battle back and forth, there is probably a background radiation which is very hard to observe except once in a while, which is an enormous amount of lobbying, training, and so on, which is being done by the EU and the US. Also, of course, trade sanction threats and so on. Just to give you a couple of examples, I found this quite funny. The US Patent Office admitted there was probably a mistake for Pfizer to actually sponsor a discussion related to intellectual property rights. Similarly, the US Patent Office was found to be, quote unquote, training Indian judges on intellectual property right issues. And maybe in the most egregious and famous case, a Supreme Court judge, Dalveer Bhandari, was found to be presiding over a case just after he had attended a couple of conferences which was sponsored by the Intellectual Property Owners Association of America. So this is really serious background radiation, let's put it that way. Is it working? Well, yes. You have these sort of news reports that come out which say that the Indian business community, and especially the generics community, are not pushing anymore, or have sort of given up the push for compulsory licensing, which is maybe the most fraught bit of flexibilities. And more importantly, I think, if you actually look at the trade structure, Indian generic industry has been merged or acquired at a rate that we hadn't seen before. Two big cases, of course, was Ranbaxy, which was taken over by Daiichi Sankyo, and Piramal, which was taken over by Abbott. What this does is it removes the natural opposition to multinational pharma, right? And so any sort of litigation has to be done primarily by civil society groups. What's the impact? Well, India used to be called the pharmacy of the developing world. This was the original reach in 2008 of antiretroviral drugs exported from India. And just to give you a sense of how it's been curtailed, since this is the license coverage for Declatsavir, which is a hepatitis C drug, and of course in the whole of Africa and South Asia, India can still export, but across the rest of the world where they were actually exporting these drugs, they're not able to do so anymore because of these provisions. Now, as bad as these things are, TRIPS had allowed some flexibility, but I think the bigger danger right now are free trade agreements. Of course, there's many of them all over, but these actually involve demands that go well beyond TRIPS, and they call TRIPS plus provisions for exactly that reason, including certain provisions in investment and investment arbitration, which makes really sort of a chilling effect for anyone who wants to infringe on the patent, even if it's not a valid patent. And finally, there are also restrictions on using health safeguards. They never call that, but in effect, there are restrictions on using health safeguards. Just to give you a sense of the rise in free trade agreements, no one is anymore thinking of working through the WTO. There's, of course, many free trade agreements which have been ratified or at least notified, and they've really exploded since 2000 and so on. I want to just mention two sorts of TRIPS plus provisions which are particularly damaging. One is patent extension, which is if for whatever reason your country has decided that it wants to slow down on the patent acceptance, you're required to give extra protection for 3 or 4 years, which can be extremely costly. Another particularly sublime one, if you want to call it, is data exclusivity, where a generic company cannot actually show bioequivalence, which is required for generic acceptance, because data is considered protected, and you can't use the originator company's data to show that your drug is equivalent, so it becomes an unchallengeable protection, an unchallengeable patent in some sense. So I'm not going to go into great detail about each one of these, except to say that it is already biting in terms of access to medicines. In Jordan, for example, many drugs are not patented, but are protected by data exclusivity. I want to end. I've not been a successfully, say, bloodless academic in this talk thus far, but I want to go back to actually trying to be a bloodless academic and to suggest two things. The first is that there is no theory in trade which really makes an argument for intellectual property. It's not there in Ricardo, it's not there in Heckscher-Ohlin, it's not there in Krugman, Brander, Dixit, Stiglitz, it's not there even in Militz, Antras, it's not there at all. On the contrary, we have theories which suggest that, in fact, if you want to maximize social benefits, Given that knowledge is non-rivalrous, that growth depends on knowledge, a social welfare maximizer would actually be abolishing intellectual property restrictions, or at least limiting the hampering of such transfers. But that's not what's occurring. I want to just end with one note about how unbalanced this has got. Returns to IP are obviously very large, and if you actually do a comparison, intellectual property royalties to the US from the developing countries starting around 2013, 2014 have been larger than US aid transfers to developing countries. So talk about an unbalanced field going forward. This is the trailer that I've just given you. If you want the 90-page movie, it's available on the website. I have the fortune that my discussant is also my co-author on this, also with Dean Baker, so I hope he's not too harsh on me. But I do think that this is one of the great tragedies of trade policy, and I hope going forward we can do something about it. Thank you very much.
Arjun, thank you. While unfortunately I come from the demographic that didn't at all get the mortar joke that all the young folks did, you made two points that we certainly will come back to. One is the sobering one, that at a time when we need more flexible approaches to IP, the gravity in trade negotiations is in the opposite direction, hegemonistic. And in that sense, there's a perverse pleasure in the fact that the TPP kind of was sunk, because this was where the action was. It was going to get really bad there and then become the basis for globalization of that regime. So small mercies there. And then your point about data, which I know we'll come back to, because data localization is now the new battlefront on these issues. So with those thoughts, we will turn to our two discussants, one of whom is conflicted, I just learned. But start with you, Pia.
Thank you. Thanks, Rohinton, and thank you for these really excellent presentations. I want to keep in mind Rohinton's consideration that much of our discussion on trade tends to be based around politics, and we cannot deny that politics runs through much of this. Politics, culture, various other factors. So I think what I want to focus on a little bit is the political economy that underlies our discussions on trade. And I want to start with a comment that Paul Krugman made in 2016 before the election, where he says, it's also true that much of the elite defense of globalization is basically dishonest. False claims of inevitability, scare tactics, protectionism causes depressions, vastly exaggerated claims for the benefits of trade liberalization and the costs of protection, hand-waving away the large distributional effects that are what standard models actually predict. The elite case for ever freer trade is largely a scam, which voters probably sense even if they don't know exactly what form it's taking. So I'd like to pick up actually on Brad's presentation, because I feel like Brad's insights may actually hold the key to some of the largest puzzles in what is driving the world revolt against globalists, as well as explaining some of the underlying factors in the other three papers that we see here. In accounting, it's necessary to define an abstract remainder term called goodwill, to account for all the ways in which the purchase price of a business may exceed the value from the summation of all the concrete assets. So if we sell a company for a particular amount, very often people will say, well, there's this extra part that we're going to refer to as goodwill, and we're going to have to come up with a catch-all category to capture these effects. So I want to take the liberty of defining a category called goodwill in the case of trade, which is going to measure the aggregate ways in which the macroeconomic loss fails to account for the effect of welfare lost by those negatively affected by trade. So this is going to be a partial taxonomy of globalist goodwill concerns that I've yet to see mentioned by the narrow accounting for the direct transfer of wealth effects of TPP and NAFTA by their proponents. So here's just a few of them. We can talk about transfers of trust. We hear with trade, everyone will be better off, jobs will be created, not lost. Transfers of dignity. people will lose jobs, but don't worry, we have earned income tax credits, we will have other ways of redistributing, so people will be fine, not taking into account that you've then taken someone who's a productive member of society and you've told them, that's okay, we're gonna take care of you with a handout. Transfers of agency. So when we talk about jobs that are lost in Ohio and may show up on the coast, maybe in Silicon Valley or in finance, we say, don't worry so much, we're gonna do this other calculation. But we're not taking into account that if you look at the geographical issues that Shannon was talking about yesterday, we've just caused a completely different setup in manufacturing states when we've exported jobs within the country to a different part of the country. Transfers of consent, so debate and open voting often become fast-tracked. Cost of contempt, so we use name-calling against protectionists. Transfers of loyalty, and I want to come back to this, where the home country losers, I believe, are tricked to benefit the poor of trade partners. Failure of Pareto or Kaldor-Hicks efficiency to capture the damage done to losers when winners reap outsized rewards, as in the relative status of positional goods, relative status loss in positional goods. Behavioral economic costs, so the underestimation of endowment effects of the loss. If you lose a job that you actually have, it feels very different. Potentially catastrophic unincorporated externalities, the 2016 election, for example. The claim, so actually just to talk a little bit about the point that I made earlier, this is an argument that I've seen about NAFTA. NAFTA has benefits, the same logic that leads us to think that the bilateral US trade deficit from NAFTA has reduced employment in the US by 350,000, leads us to think that it has boosted employment in Mexico by 1.5 million. That's 3% of the Mexican labor force. Mexico's unemployment rate is currently 5%. Would we really wish to be in a world where it was 8%? So when we look at what we have here, I would claim that this is what led to the rise of economic nationalism in the US. We are talking about transfers from a wealthy country to a poor country, and as someone who comes from a developing country, I want to say that I strongly support this. The problem, I believe, is that if you look at the internal distribution, we're asking for transfers from the relatively poor within America to the poor in another country. When it comes to actually looking at transfers from the wealthy, example, the pharma industry, you're going to see protections go in another direction. So we will not ask people, we will not ask the wealthy in America who are actually able to afford these transfers to undertake transfers to poorer countries, but we're perfectly willing to place that burden on the people who can least afford it in this country. So the claim that the costs of TPP and NAFTA-like agreements are small, seen in this slide, changes the picture considerably. In order for that to continue to be true, when Goodwill is added, means that the honest analyst must posit 3 separate claims. One, that there's a way of weighting the measurable gains and losses that can plausibly be said to represent the best interests of the signatory country. 2, that these measurable gains outweigh the measurable costs when so weighted. And 3, the costs in national goodwill, as in the partial taxonomy I've just talked about, is small. So, according to Brad, trade economists have used the simplistic doctrine of comparative advantage to argue for free trade as a cryptic proxy for the real arguments in the esoteric theory of free trade. So this, I believe, is hugely helpful in understanding where we are. Now that we've understood that many of us have been arguing with a mere stalking horse theory, perhaps we can ask our colleagues in trade to have some more faith in the analytic abilities of others. So I do believe, in some sense, the 2016 election in the US was a commentary where Middle America said to the coastal elites, the emperor has no clothes. We understand that you've been giving us the exoteric arguments, and we understand that they're not quite working. And really, if the esoteric argument, the argument within trade, is that we have a social Darwinist welfare function, we can understand why we're seeing the kind of populist backlash we have. So I believe that the cost of goodwill alone to society may have been radically miscalculated, and trade might well explain the backlash that we just heard about in Kaveh's paper, and would be entirely consistent with the export of low-value supply chains that Nadia talks about in Italy. Thank you.
You've set up the subsequent discussion very well, but last and not least, I turn it over to you, Joe.
Well, thank you very much. I think the presentations have been really good and the discussing so far. What I want to do is, again, use Bragg's framework, which I think highlights many of the issues and provides a structure. And he begins with Ricardo's argument for comparative advantage, which is a particular model. The neoclassical, or the basic framework that is inculcated in modern economics in their textbooks, actually doesn't really come so much from Ricardo as from Samuelson's work in the 30s, where he showed in the standard framework that has become the neoclassical model that both sides that free trade is Pareto efficient, that everybody could be better off if you had lump sum redistributions. And understanding what the assumptions that go into that model is really important. It's an equilibrium theory where there's full adjustment. It's a model in which knowledge is identical across countries, so the issues that Arjun raised are not there. And it's a model that ignores uncertainty, all kinds of market imperfections. So there are two separate issues that I think we need to highlight. One, or three issues. What are the failures of the model itself? Within the model, what are the conditions, as we extend the model, what are the conditions in which the market doesn't generate a Pareto efficient outcome? And then the third, even if Pareto efficient, we do care about distribution. And what does modern theory say about that issue? So on the first issue, the missing elements of the theory, there are several comments. First, as I said, it ignores uncertainty and the absence of perfect insurance markets. This is one of the great contributions of Ken Arrow in establishing the Pareto efficiency of the market, which is the underlying hypothesis that markets in general work. And one of the results that I proved with David Newberry more than 30 years ago was that in the absence of perfect risk markets, with all the standard assumptions, even Cobb-Douglas utility functions and so forth, free trade could be Pareto inferior. That is to say, everybody could be worse off. So the presumption that free trade actually makes everybody better off is made under really strong assumptions that we know are wrong, that there's no uncertainty, for instance. The second, you might say, category of arguments have to do with equilibrium and adjustment. The point, as Brad made, about unemployment. We know that there's unemployment, and this is if people weren't worried about unemployment, our politics would be markedly different. Well, one of the things that one sees very clearly is that often as we liberalize, trade destruction occurs faster than trade creation. That's a disequilibrium phenomena. I mean, they should occur at exactly the same pace. And that's true whether we have good macroeconomics or not. Even if macroeconomics adjust, the trade destruction can occur in places faster than the job creation. Why is that? Well, in part, that has to do with another set of market failures, for instance, lack of access to capital. So you can't expand the sectors where there are new job potentials, can't get access to capital to expand, lack of access to markets. The more general fact that labor, moving labor from one place to another, it's been emphasized in a couple of these papers, is costly. It's not a zero cost. And the assumption was that all this labor mobility is costless. Moreover, with imperfect capital markets, people don't have access to the resources they need to move. And there's good reason for this, explained by the theories of asymmetric information. So these are inherent market failures, inherent in the presence of imperfect information, which is an inherent part of any economy. So in the presence of these kinds of rigidities, it turns out, again, trade liberalization can be Pareto inferior. Everybody can be worse off. So the presumption that trade is going to be welfare enhancing is very strongly contingent on a whole set of assumptions about the way markets work. A third set of issues that I'm not going to comment on more than just to mention is something that actually Paul Krugman emphasized, which is that we live in a world with imperfect competition. And that's become particularly important as we have supply chain. There may be only 2 firms supplying a particular part of the supply chain. And so an assumption that was central to the neoclassical analysis and neoliberal policy framework is clearly wrong. And finally, within this category of failures in the model is the importance of knowledge. Knowledge either as a result of learning by doing, knowledge in the form of research. And here, just let me emphasize that while the trade agenda has been to facilitate the movement of goods, services, and even capital across boundaries, it's really designed to inhibit the movement of knowledge across boundaries. It's sort of, they call it a free trade agenda, but it's not really free movement of knowledge across boundaries. It's actually quite the opposite. So the final point, and really important, is the distributive effects. And I think there's a general consensus now that the magnitude of the distributive effects outweigh the general gains, which may actually be negative, but in any case are smaller once you take into account all the market failures than the distributive effects. And so even if it were the case that if one made the redistributions, one would have to argue that the cost of those redistributions are relatively low. And if they're not low, again, it may be Pareto inferior. And then the reality is we don't make the redistributions, even if we could. And the result of that is it is not the case that trade liberalization is Pareto superior. And that's where I think the way that several people have presented this, that it is an agenda of advantaging the comparatively advantaged is really key. Well, given that my time's up, I want to spend just 1 minute on the knowledge issue. And I think that highlights some of the political economy of what is going on. The part of the knowledge agenda that is at the core of the trade agreements is knowledge about drugs. And let me make it very clear, I've participated in this when I was in the White House when TRIPS was being discussed. And it was very clear, both the Council of Economic Advisors and the Office of Science and Technology Policy really opposed the provisions of TRIPS. Why? Because we thought it was not good for American science, for global science, for the developing countries. It was not a welfare-enhancing part of the trade agreement. Well, why do we have it? Well, it was very clear. It was in the interest of the drug companies. I was just at a conference where a lot of Nobel Prize winners who have done the basic work in advancing knowledge, and almost to a person, they were against these intellectual property provisions. They said, we don't patent these ideas because we want these ideas to go out. Would they have been affected by a different intellectual property regime? Would their research have been inhibited? Unambiguously, no. So this is not about the production of knowledge. This is about the appropriation of rents, and rents by American farmers. Now you say, what is this about in America, America's drug industry? It's a really amazing agenda because the American drug industry is not creating jobs in the United States. These drugs, when we do these trade agreements, it's not about the creation of jobs in the United States. Much of the production occurs in China. These drug companies don't pay taxes. They are particularly talented in finding ways of avoiding taxes and moving the patents to low tax jurisdictions like Ireland, and production in Singapore, so they don't have to pay taxes. The global trade agreements could have solved the problem, but the global trade agreements were focused on double taxation, not on zero taxation. We have no zero taxation, no trade agreement that says we're going to try to avoid zero taxation. They're all about double taxation. So if we're not getting tax revenue, if we're not getting jobs, why is the US government at the center of trying to create barriers to the movement of knowledge which would enhance global productivity? Well, we all know the answer to that is campaign contributions. And so in a government where money matters, we get the political economy that we have. I suppose all of this is a discussion about political economy in the end, and that's where the paper that Kaveh presented was very, very forceful, that the way the trade agreements have in fact worked has been adverse to the interest of many of the people who pushed these trade agreements. And I think it was not just campaign contribution. I think they came to believe that trade was going to benefit all. They believed that trickle-down economics was going to work. And one of the things that this panel and INET is trying to do is to say those ideas were wrong. We should have known they were wrong 25 years ago or 40 years ago, but we didn't listen fully to the economists, and that's where what you said in the beginning is very important. The way we frame it, the discussions and what we teach, where we left out all the things I've just talked about, led a lot of people to believe that everybody would benefit. It was all the qualifications that came at the end of the textbooks that we never got to in our courses that were the main part of the story. And we focused on we left out the main part of the story, and I think that's now come home to bite us. Joe, thank you.
And thank you all. And Kaveh, I notice you're live with us. I'm sorry, I thought you were by Memorex, but this is even better. I'd like to sort of begin by asking our four presenters something that goes beyond trade, but touches on absolutely what we're talking about, which is there is, I think, a healthy case to be made, and Joe just made it, that there are some instances where trade leaves everyone worse off, in which case liberalization is not the answer. Leave that aside and think about the cases where it is not a clean Pareto improvement, that there's winners and losers, which is what each of you in your own way sort of spoke to. Is this all about trade? The case is now being made that actually what the antidote to this is to rediscover domestic social policy, to rediscover things that, again, ideology forced us to forget. But it is about social safety nets, it's about education systems, it's about innovation strategies, it's about all those things that are market interventions that actually improve social welfare. and trade has become the bogeyman for a bunch of national domestic failures. And I'd like to go, if it's okay with you, in the same order and get a reaction from you first, Brad.
A very difficult and hard question. And let me give a particular answer to it, motivated, I think, in large part by the fact that it strikes me that the five of us agree on too much, that there's insufficient Dixit Stiglitz variety in the panel for it to be in any sense optimal. So let me, for the moment, attempt to fly my rootless neoliberal cosmopolite freak flag and try to give a little pushback against the idea that a better social insurance state is what we need. As if you think about, say, the people of rural Kentucky facing the continued long-term downfall in the coal industry and in low-end manufacturing subject to competition from China. If you wanted to do anything to make their lives better from 2009 to 2016, it would have been Obamacare, right? Give them health insurance, give them access to the health insurance plan. The Democratic Party did that. They turned out 70% for Trump and for Republicans in the 2016 election and spent early 2017 staggering out in a daze, telling reporters, they weren't really trying to get rid of my Medicaid, are they? They aren't really getting rid of my exchange policy, are they? You know, that other things are going on. If you want to back up, you can say that in America, right, the quit plus the firing rate, the hiring rate, it's 3% per month. 3% of all the jobs in the United States are destroyed each month. 15% to 18% of all the jobs in the United States are destroyed each year. People have to find new jobs. The US has a country with remarkably low job duration for a great many people, yet that has never been a subject of particular extraordinary political concern. High unemployment is, job turnover isn't. The things that are subjects of particular concern are the concentrated region industry shocks. And we have had 5 of these concentrated region industry shocks since, say, the 1930s. There was the Southern textile shock in North Carolina and Virginia that led to the collapse of blue-collar employment in New England from the 1930s to the 1950s. There was the Reagan deficit shock to Midwestern manufacturing in Michigan and elsewhere in the 1980s. There was the right-to-work shock, in which right-to-work states made a big bid for manufacturing employment in the United States by promising to suppress unions from the 1980s to 2000s. There was the oil price shock in the 1980s when Saudi Arabia upended the world configuration of oil prices. There was the China shock of 2000s. And note, there is no NAFTA shock in the 1990s. The communities that lost jobs when NAFTA hit in the 1990s more or less quickly found them again, and people transitioned relatively easily because it was a high-pressure economy and it wasn't a great source of political upset and concern. And we seem to have a world in which, you know, they have three of these shocks due to trade: the Reagan deficit shock, the right-to-work shock, the China shock. 2 of the shocks are not really due to trade: the Southern textile shock, the right-to-work shock. These are internal to the United States. And what we really need is a grammar for why some of these shocks have produced powerful and awful and destructive resonances in our politics, and others have not, since they're all concentrated region industry shocks, and they're all driven by the workings of the market economy.
Nadia, from the European perspective, where would you come out on this?
Well, of course, I don't know much about the US situation. I would just maybe say something about what happens in the EU. You were talking about concentrating on social and living standards within each, let's say, nation. And of course, I think that in the EU, one of the problems is that we have common rules for certain things, let's say freedom of movement of capital, people, commodities, and whatever. But then we have completely different standards for everything else in different countries. So what we see is that these differentials of wage, social conditions, and whatever is something which can be taken advantage of for shaping this kind of, trade structures, and also, of course, negative effects of these that Pia was mentioning before. So I think that probably we should, yes, try to concentrate a little bit more on social standards within each country, but not in a way like going back to, not in a protectionist sense, in the strict sense of the word, but just to try to solve these, to kind of eliminate these differentials without the race to bottom, which we were mentioning before, but trying to have common standards in the whole EU. Otherwise, I think that the competition between workers of different countries, which I was mentioning, will just get worse. We just make this phenomenon go further, and this, I think, has very much to do also with the right-wing. What we are seeing in Europe is that in almost all countries, especially those which are experiencing this huge phenomenon of being involved in international chains, are experiencing also an upswing of right-wing parties, and I think that this also has very much to do with negative effects of what we are talking about. So concentrating somehow on education, health system, and also industrial systems in each and every country should be something which should have to be tackled by the EU and by national governments within the EU, or I think things will get worse.
Kaveh, might your results be interpreted as an indictment of domestic policy in the US rather than Chinese trade practices?
Sure. So the thing is that I don't believe that this is just trade, right? So as Brad mentioned, so we have had trade shocks before. In the 90s, we don't see much. When we do our analysis for the period 02 to 06 or 02 to 08, although we get like similar signs, the effects are not nearly as acute. So, and when we look at the effect of financial crisis, actually we do get similar effects. So I do believe that the reason we get such drastic effects here is that this shock that we are looking at came at the back of the financial crisis and the election of President Obama. So I do believe it is actually important to take into account that it was not just the trade shock. Now, do I think that social safety nets are important? To be honest, I don't know the answer. The reason being that when we look at the shocks, the trade shocks in Europe, which arguably have better social safety nets, apparently didn't help that much with how people reacted to it on the election day. Now, whether education works, I don't know either, but that's my backup option when I don't know what works. So I would go for that for now.
Okay. Arjun, any thoughts?
Okay, since I'm representing a little bit of variety in the Stiglitz sense of representing developing countries, let me just say the following. We do not anyway have the social safety net, so we have to think slightly differently in developing countries about this. My sense is that one of the things that Brad referred to, industrial policy, is something that, again, I think will make a comeback at some point or the other when we're thinking about how to deal with trade again. I think it's been a completely misstated history of how industrial policy has actually worked. We've had these ideas that it's only been crony capitalism right through, and that's really transferred through, and industrial policy remains a bad word in some places. I do think that is a kind of way that we would actually have to think about dealing with these effects of trade. I should also just like to underline something that Joe mentioned, which is right now the advantages to free trade, the efficiency gains are so tiny relative to the redistributive changes that I think there's a case for industrial policy through and through. So.
Okay. I'm going to sort of end, since we only have a few minutes left, by asking each 6 of you to reflect in a minute or so of what you think the frontier of research and policy might be. But on the question of IP, pharma, and rents, I can't resist. The trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, 2 relatively progressive countries, the IP section, 90% of it is about pharma. And so don't underestimate interests. And so I'm betraying to you what I'd say if I had a minute, but I don't, you all do. So I'd like to go, if it's okay with you, in reverse order this time and start with you, Joe.
Well, I think a lot of the research agenda, I think, has to do with what I said in the beginning, that our standard model, the neoclassical model, leaves out everything that's important. And so we really have to put these adjustment factors, the redistribution, uncertainty back into the model. And I think, and the supply chain issues that were raised back into the model. But I also want to a little bit answer the previous question that you asked, because I do think that in part the consequences of trade depend on the context in which we are, so that while it may not fully be reflected in voting patterns, in terms of the welfare consequences, it's very clear that if we have a better, a Nordic model, the openness to trade is very different than in a context of a social Darwinist model. And I think that is, in the end, I think we have to think about the moving towards a more Nordic model if we want to stay open, if we want our societies to remain open.
Thank you. Pia?
I think I'm very much on the same page. I think one of the issues you brought up was the idea that we have this idea of the Pareto optimum that trade provides, and at the very best we can say it's Kaldor-Hicks and we need the redistribution, and that piece never happens. And I think to the extent that we have a social structure where we have a more egalitarian society to start with, we're just not going to be running into as many of these issues. And the other thing I want to point out is I think there's really this issue of the star chamber, that economists essentially don't bring other people into the conversation as it really exists in our minds. Thank you. I think what we saw in this 2016 backlash is that people said, you guys know something that you're not telling us. We know all these issues with the free trade model. And I think at heart, we knew that there was a social Darwinist model underlying our policies, and that's just terrifying. If we're starting out with a more egalitarian society, we're in a position where we can start actually figuring out what the political economy is around things like the TRIPS agreement, so that we actually take money from the people who can afford it to spread to the rest of the world.
Arjun?
I actually don't have anything really to add, so I'll give it to Kaveh.
I've never been on a panel like this where people give up their time. Kaveh?
Thank you. So one thing that I definitely want to know more about is how economic shocks kind of change the evolution of individuals' beliefs about different subjects. People are talking about tribalism and that sort of thing as a result of negative shocks, but I don't believe we know enough about it. It would be, I think it's important to know how people feel and how people change their beliefs as a result of shocks.
Thank you. Nadia?
I think that we already have a trade and economic theory which is alternative to the standard neoclassical one. So from a theoretical point of view, I think we should just go back to that kind of theory and abandon the neoclassical framework. And from an empirical point of view, I think this alternative theory lacks empirical work trying to test it and show that it works. And so maybe going further with empirical applications of this alternative theory could be a good way to put the two strands of thought on the same ground and try to have a fruitful debate about that.
Brett?
Well, I think that we can do very little, right? That Joe Stiglitz is an economist and was, in fact, the highest economist in the world in the late 1990s, arguing that TRIPS was a bad idea. that it enriched not America, but rather holders of pharmaceutical patents, and that it did so at the cost of charging poor countries like Vietnam and Congo through the nose for intellectual property that was non-rival in some very basic sense, and for which the appropriate market price was zero. And so one thing we should be doing is we should be pushing very hard for an expanded public sector, for a public sector that will, in fact, produce real marginal cost pricing for things that are rival only because of increasingly sophisticated and onerous layers of protectionism. But because it's not protectionism at a movements of good level, somehow it doesn't count as protectionism. And at this point, I want to incorporate by reference the entire works of Dean Baker over the past 25 years. And let me stop there.
Brett, thank you. So, thank you to all, and thank you to our panel for reminding us that exceptions matter, institutions matter, politics matters, and above all, that people matter. And thank you above all to a panel that has been as thoughtful and generous as it has been this morning. Have a good afternoon.